The neighborhood had grown tense in recent months. The Homeowners Association, once known for mild complaints about lawns or mailbox paint, had turned into something resembling a private police force. They patrolled in black tactical uniforms, with HOA emblazoned across their vests, carrying themselves like lawmen despite having no legal authority. Their radios squawked on the street corners, their flashlights shone into backyards after dusk, and their clipboards transformed into weapons of intimidation. Grandpa Henry, a stubborn 80-year-old veteran with a steel back and sharp eyes, had lived in his home since the early 1970s. He had built the fence with his own hands, planted the oak tree in the front yard, and polished the brass handle on his front door until it gleamed. This was his castle, and no self-important neighborhood committee was going to tell him otherwise. The problems began when Henry refused to cut down his old flagpole. It was taller than regulations allowed, rusted at the base, but still proudly raised the stars and stripes. The HOA had cited him 3 times, then fined him. He tore up their letters and tossed them into the fireplace. The association escalated. It was late one summer morning when the HOA patrol pulled up in their SUV, black and white like police cruisers, but with community compliance written across the sides. 2 officers stepped out, one with a shaved head and a permanent scowl, the other young, muscular, and cocky. They carried holstered weapons, though no one could tell if they were real or just props to enhance their image. Watering the grass, when they approached, he didn't flinch. His red shirt hung crisp on his shoulders, sleeves rolled up, and his silver hair glistened in the sun. The patrolman accused him of noncompliance, warned him that action would be taken. Neighbors peeked through blinds as voices rose. Then came the moment that silenced the street. One officer drew his gun and aimed it directly at Henry. But Henry didn't panic. His left hand calmly rested behind his back. Fingers curled around the handle of an old revolver, a Colt, 1911 from 1948, handed down from his father, polished, oiled, and unknown to the patrol, fully loaded. The street froze in time. The HOA cop barked threats, spit flying from his mouth, finger trembling on the trigger. The second officer flanked Henry, waiting for a sign to strike, but Henry's jaw tightened, and a ghost of a smile spread across his lips. He was not afraid. He had faced worse enemies before, and in that moment, the neighborhood realized that the HOA had crossed a line from nuisance to tyranny. The standoff had just begun. The Colt revolver in Henry's hand was more than just a weapon. It was history, legacy, and a silent witness to the struggles of an entire family. For decades, it had rested in a cedar box at the back of a closet, wrapped in a faded oilcloth, untouched but never forgotten. Henry's father, a World War II veteran, had brought it back after his service, a reminder of battles fought and sacrifices made. When Henry came of age, his father entrusted him with it, not as a tool of violence, but as a reminder of resilience. It was an artifact of an era when men stood firm against oppression and when a home meant something sacred. Henry had never fired it in anger, but he had kept it maintained with a ritualistic devotion. Once every month, he would disassemble it, polish the metal, and reassemble it with steady hands that still carried the precision of his military training. His children had grown up seeing the weapon only as a relic, a story to tell, and nothing more. But Henry knew better. A relic could become a shield, and a shield could become salvation. The HOA patrol didn't know any of this. To them, he was just an old man in a red shirt, cornered and stubborn, too proud to bend. They saw his age as weakness, his defiance as an insult. They didn't know that behind his calm eyes lay the discipline of a man who had once worn a uniform, carried a rifle, and seen what real tyranny looked like. As the patrolman's finger twitched dangerously close to the trigger, Henry shifted, his weight slightly, just enough to let the revolver's grip press firmly into his palm. The subtle move was unseen by most, but a neighbor's camera phone, secretly recording from behind a curtain, caught everything. That footage, still hidden from the world, would soon ignite outrage far beyond their quiet suburb. The silence stretched. A bird chirped in the distance, then fell quiet. The patrolman barked an order again, but Henry didn't move. His heart was steady. He thought of his late wife, of the promise he made to always protect their home, and of the countless times he had told his children that freedom was worth standing for. Even if standing alone, the second officer, the younger one, shifted nervously. His eyes darted between Henry and his partner. He hadn't expected the confrontation to escalate this far. To him, this was supposed to be intimidation, a quick scare to bring an old man into compliance. Instead, he found himself facing the unshakable presence of someone who refused to bow. Henry spoke no words. He let the weight of silence crush the false authority in front of him. His revolver remained hidden, but his resolve radiated so strongly that even the neighbors watching felt it in their bones. Inside, Henry's grandson, Tom, peeked from the window. He was only 19, college-bound, and unprepared for what he saw. His grandfather, standing unarmed to the eye, stared down men with guns like it was a routine chore. Tom's chest tightened with both fear and pride. That image would etch itself into his memory forever. Finally, the patrolman pushed forward, his gun still raised. He threatened legal action, fines, removal, even arrest. He believed the neighborhood rules gave him power greater than the Constitution. He believed fear would bend Henry like it had bent so many others. But Henry remembered Okinawa. He remembered marching for miles with blistered feet and no water. He remembered the bombs, the smoke, the deafening chaos of war. Compared to that, two men in black vests were nothing more than noise. The HOA patrol didn't realize it, but they were not facing an old man. They were facing history, grit, and the unbroken spirit of a generation built on sacrifice. And behind Henry's back, his father's revolver gleamed faintly in the sun. Ready, waiting, loaded. The confrontation was far from over. In fact, it was only about to escalate into something the HOA would never forget. The HOA patrolman's voice rose, sharp and commanding, echoing through the quiet suburban street. The muzzle of his gun wavered in the summer air, steady enough to kill, but trembling with arrogance. He believed the scene was under his control, that his authority was absolute, and that the man in front of him was too old, too frail to resist. But Henry's silence was not surrender. It was strategy. Neighbors had abandoned their blinds and curtains by now. Some had stepped onto porches, phones in hand, recording every second. The HOA patrol had become too bold, too reckless, and now the entire block had front row seats too. Their display of power, Tom, still watching from the window, could barely breathe. He pressed his palm against the glass, as if he could somehow push strength into his grandfather from inside the house. He had grown up hearing Henry's stories about service, sacrifice, and freedom. But seeing it unfold in real time with guns, drawn in the middle of their street, was something else entirely. The younger officer muttered something under his breath, glancing toward the cluster of onlookers. His nerves betrayed him. He hadn't signed up for this level of exposure. He had joined the HOA patrol for easy authority, a paycheck, and maybe the thrill of lording over neighbors. He hadn't expected his partner to aim a gun at a decorated veteran in broad daylight. Henry finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he shifted his stance, planting both feet firmly in the grass, his hands still clasped behind his back. Tightened around the handle of the Colt, he could feel the cold steel, the familiar weight, the subtle click of the cylinder resting snugly in place. The patrolman barked another order, louder this time. His words were almost drowned by the pounding of blood in Henry's ears. He did not fear death. He had looked it in the eyes before. What he feared was surrendering the dignity of his home, the sanctity of the land he had cared for, the promise he had made to his wife as she lay in her final days. "No one will drive me from this house, then." It happened. The officer stepped forward aggressively, waving the gun just inches from Henry's chest. The crowd gasped. A baby cried in the distance, and in that instant, Henry drew the Colt from behind his back. The movement was fluid, faster than anyone expected from an 80-year-old man. His hand rose with the steadiness of a soldier trained to act without hesitation. The revolver glinted under the sun, its aged steel catching the light like a beacon of defiance. The HOA patrolman froze mid-sentence. His mouth hung open, his finger still curled on the trigger. But he suddenly realized the balance of power had shifted. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Some screamed. Others shouted for the officers to back down. Camera phones zoomed closer, capturing the surreal sight of a neighborhood dispute escalating into a full-fledged standoff between an old veteran and self-styled enforcers. Henry didn't aim recklessly. His revolver was pointed directly at the man's weapon hand. Steady, controlled, a silent promise that the first wrong move would end it. His eyes narrowed, unblinking, like he had returned to the battlefield of his youth. The younger officer's face paled. He reached for his radio, fumbling with nervous hands. His voice cracked as he called for backup, though everyone knew there was no real authority behind their badges, no sanctioned squad that would come rushing to their aid. They had pretended to be police for too long, and now the truth was, exposed for a long, unbearable moment, no one moved. The three men stood locked in a triangle of fear, pride, and history. Henry's heart beat steady, as if time itself slowed for him. He thought of his brothers in arms, who never made it home, of the oath he once took to protect his country, and of the bitter irony that now he had to stand guard against his own neighbors masquerading as lawmen. The officer holding the gun began to sweat. His bravado slipped with each passing second. He had expected submission, not resistance. He had expected fear, not a loaded Colt aimed back at him. Then Henry spoke not with words, but with silence, his revolver unwavering, his body unmoving, his will unbreakable. And in that silence, the neighborhood chose its side. A murmur rose from the porches, from the sidewalks, from every house that had felt the sting of HOA harassment. It was quiet at first, then louder, a unified presence that said, without speaking, enough. The patrolman's grip faltered, his hand twitched. For a fraction of a second, it looked as though he might pull the trigger out of desperation. But Henry's eyes stopped him cold. The Colt was still loaded, still aimed, still waiting. The standoff had reached its breaking point, and everyone knew something had to give. The world seemed to stop breathing. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every sound of suburban life went silent as Henry and the HOA patrolman locked eyes. It was no longer about a flagpole or a citation or neighborhood rules. It had become a test of will, of courage, of who would falter first when the line between fear and defiance grew razor-thin. The officer's arm quivered. Sweat trickled down his temple, stinging his eyes. His partner shifted behind Henry, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. The crowd of neighbors had swelled, their voices rising, though muffled by the adrenaline pounding in Henry's ears. The Colt was steady in his grip, the aged steel unmoved, his finger resting with deliberate care on the trigger. Then came the moment of fracture. The officer, desperate to reclaim authority, lunged forward. His finger jerked, the muzzle of his pistol flashing as the trigger snapped. The sound of the shot tore through the street like thunder. A deafening crack that made children scream and adults duck for cover. But Henry had moved first. Decades of reflex, drilled into his bones by training long before these men were even born, guided his hand. His revolver roared in reply, a single thunderous blast that echoed against the houses. Smoke curled from the barrel as the shot rang out, sharp and decisive. The patrolman's gun clattered to the pavement, his hand convulsing from the impact. The bullet had struck Trunot in his chest, not in his head, but in his weapon hand. Shattering his grip and sending his false authority scattering across the ground, gasps erupted from the crowd. Some cheered, others shouted, but all knew they had witnessed the end of the HOA's intimidation that very instant. The younger officer froze. His wide eyes darted from his fallen partner to the smoking Colt in Henry's hand. He reached for his own gun but stopped halfway, paralyzed by the weight of choice. He could escalate or he could surrender. The entire neighborhood, cameras rolling, stood as witnesses. Henry's voice did not rise, but his presence spoke louder than any shout. He did not need to fire again. The message had been delivered with that single round, as clear as if it had been carved in stone. This house is defended. This man will not bow. The injured patrolman clutched his hand, groaning in shock, his arrogance drained in an instant. His partner stumbled backward, muttering excuses, his courage unraveling under the eyes of the community. They had strutted into the neighborhood with guns and bravado, expecting fear. Instead, they found themselves outmatched by a man old enough to be their grandfather, wielding not just a weapon but the indomitable will of history. Tom burst from the front door. Unable to stay inside any longer, He rushed to his grandfather's side, his face pale but burning with pride. He saw the revolver smoking in Henry's hand, saw the HOA patrol recoiling in disgrace, and understood in that moment the true meaning of courage. Neighbors poured from their houses. Some surrounded Henry protectively, others confronted the HOA. Officers shouting that they were done being bullied, done being fined, done being treated like criminals in their own homes. The tide had shifted, the fear had broken, and the HOA's illusion of power collapsed in the light of a single act of defiance. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called the real police. The HOA officers, pale and humiliated, scrambled. To retreat before the truth of their actions came under official scrutiny, the wounded patrolman was dragged away by his partner, leaving behind a trail of blood and the shattered remains of his weapon. Henry stood firm, revolver still in hand, his face calm as if he had simply swatted away a nuisance. He slowly lowered the Colt, resting it against his side, smoke still curling from its barrel. The crowd erupted into applause, not of violence, but of justice, of relief, of knowing that someone had finally stood up against years of overreach. Henry didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't gloat. He only nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement, then turned to his grandson. The boy's eyes brimmed with tears. Henry placed a steady hand on his shoulder, passing down something far heavier than the Colt itself, the burden of understanding what it meant to defend what was yours, even when the world turned against you. But Henry also knew this wasn't the end. The HOA would not take humiliation lightly. They would return, angrier, more determined, desperate to reassert control. This battle had been won, but the war for the neighborhood's freedom was only beginning, and Henry would be ready. The sirens grew louder, their shrill echoes bouncing through the cul-de-sacs until 2 squad cars pulled into the street. Real officers stepped out, hands hovering near their holsters, eyes sweeping over the crowd. What they found was a scene. Already balanced on the knife's edge of history, neighbors united. A wounded pretender clutching his shattered hand, and an old man with a smoking revolver hanging steady at his side. The officers moved cautiously, uncertain at first who was the threat. But the crowd didn't hesitate. Voices rang out in unison, telling the truth, pointing fingers at the self-styled HOA cops who had escalated a citation into an armed standoff. Dozens of camera phones shot into the air, their lenses capturing every angle. The HOA's narrative was dead before it could even be written. Henry placed the Colt on the ground without protest, his movements slow, deliberate. He knew the law. He knew that even when justice was on his side, appearances mattered. His grandson Tom picked it up carefully when instructed, his hands trembling but proud to carry the heirloom that had saved them all. The real officers restrained the HOA patrolman, who sputtered excuses about compliance and authority. But the neighbors shouted louder, reciting years of fines, harassment, and intimidation. The truth overwhelmed the lies. The wounded officer was taken to an ambulance, his pride more damaged than his flesh, while his partner sat pale and trembling. In the back of a squad car by nightfall, the news had spread beyond the neighborhood. Footage flooded the internet, stitched together from countless perspectives. Headlines screamed across screens. HOA patrol draws gun on veteran gets shot down by history. Talk shows debated the rise of neighborhood tyrants. Comment sections burned with outrage and admiration. For the first time in years, the HOA's grip cracked. Members resigned in embarrassment. Fines were rescinded. Residents began speaking up, their voices emboldened by Henry's example. The illusion of control that had loomed over the subdivision crumbled under the weight of truth. Henry became an unwilling symbol. Reporters camped at the edge of his driveway, hungry for words. Politicians called him, some to thank him, others to use him as a prop. He waved them all off. He didn't care for fame. He didn't care for politics. He only cared for the promise he had kept, that no one would take his home while he still drew breath. But inside, Henry was not unchanged. He sat on his porch in the evenings, the Colt resting beside him on the table, polished once more and ready. He thought often of his wife, imagined her sitting in the rocking chair across from him, her eyes crinkling with that smile she gave only him. He whispered to her sometimes, telling her the house was still theirs, still standing, still safe. Tom, meanwhile, carried the lessons forward. He told friends at school about that day, not with bravado, but with reverence. He spoke of courage, of standing when no one else would, of how one act of resistance could ignite an entire community. The boy had grown in an instant, molded by the sight of his grandfather holding the line. The HOA tried once more to regroup, to salvage its authority, but it was too late. The state attorney investigated. Lawsuits piled up, their funds dried out, their reputation shattered. Within 6 months, the HOA dissolved, its charter revoked, its members scattered. What had once been a shadow of power became nothing more. Then a cautionary tale whispered in other neighborhoods. The oak tree in Henry's yard stood taller than ever, its branches wide and proud, shading the flagpole that still rose defiantly above the houses. Every morning Henry raised the flag himself, the fabric snapping in the breeze, a sound as steady and resolute as his own heart. Neighbors saluted, not just the cloth, but the man who refused to let it fall. The Colt 1911 was placed back in its cedar box, eventually wrapped once more in its faded oilcloth, but this time it was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a reminder etched into the present, a chapter of history reborn in the quiet streets of suburbia. Henry knew his battles were mostly behind him. His body slowed, his bones ached, his breath came shorter than before. But his spirit, sharpened by war and tempered by love, remained unbreakable. He had shown the world that age did not mean weakness, that tyranny could wear any uniform, and that a home was worth defending at any cost. On his final summer evening of that turbulent year, Henry sat on his porch as the sun dipped low, bathing the neighborhood in golden light. Children played in the yards, free from the shadow of fines and threats. Parents laughed together on sidewalks, their shoulders lighter without the burden of fear. The neighborhood lived again, truly lived, because one man had stood when no one else dared. Henry closed his eyes, the faintest smile curling at the edges of his lips. He had kept his promise, and the world, for once, had remembered what it meant to be free.